Welcome back to the Daily Crypto Deep Dive. Today, we are talking about one of those stories that sounds absolutely catastrophic when you first hear it, but gets even more interesting the more closely you look at it. Because the headline was simple, dramatic, and built to spread fast. 1 billion fake DOT minted on Ethereum. And if you just hear that line on its own, it sounds like total disaster. It sounds like Polkadot has been ripped open. It sounds like billions have vanished. It sounds like the kind of exploit that should have smashed confidence across the market and left a huge crater behind it. But when you actually dig into what happened, the story is both more specific and more revealing than that. Because this was not really a story about Polkadot itself breaking. It was a story about bridges, about wrapped assets, about liquidity, and about one of crypto's biggest unresolved weaknesses still sitting right there in plain sight. And that is what makes this fascinating, because the real lesson here is not just that a hacker minted fake tokens. The real lesson is that crypto still has a bridge problem, and every time the industry starts acting like interoperability is a solved issue, something like this comes along and reminds everyone that it really is not. So let's start with the part that grabbed attention. A huge amount of fake DOT-linked tokens were minted on Ethereum through Hyperbridge. Huge as in absurd. Huge as in headline grabbing. Huge as in exactly the kind of number that makes people panic before they have even read the second sentence. But the key thing to understand right from the beginning is that this was not native DOT on the Polkadot chain being magically created out of thin air. This was not someone breaking into the Polkadot base layer and rewriting reality. What appears to have happened is that the exploit hit the bridge representation of DOT on Ethereum. In simple terms, it was the bridged version, the wrapped or linked version, not the native asset supply on Polkadot mainnet itself. That distinction matters more than most people realize, because in crypto, people often talk about assets as if they are exactly the same everywhere. DOT is DOT, Ethereum is Ethereum, Bitcoin is Bitcoin. But in practice, when assets move across chains, they usually do not literally move in some magical, frictionless way. What you often end up with is a representation of the original asset sitting somewhere else, backed by some bridge logic, some verification mechanism, some messaging system, and some trust assumptions that most normal users never think about. And that is fine when everything works. But when it does not work, all those hidden assumptions suddenly matter a lot. Because that is where this story really lives. It lives in the gap between what crypto promises and how crypto actually works under stress. The promise is simple: a multi-chain future where assets can move anywhere, capital is fluid, ecosystems are connected, and users barely need to think about what chain they are on. That is the dream. But the machinery underneath that dream is often messy, technical, fragile, and full of places where things can go wrong. And bridges have been one of the worst offenders for years. That is worth saying very clearly. The base chains often survive. The bridges are where the damage keeps happening. And once you understand that, this whole story starts to make much more sense. Because the exploit was not just about minting fake tokens. The deeper issue was control. If an attacker can manipulate the bridge logic, forge the right message, or gain administrative control over the token representation on the destination chain, then the minting itself becomes the easy part. Once the door is open, making fake assets is not the hard bit. The hard bit is turning those fake assets into real money before the market realizes what is happening and slams the exits shut. And that is where this story takes a turn that is honestly almost darkly funny. Because the attacker managed to mint a ridiculous amount of fake value, but only extracted a tiny fraction of what the headline number suggested. That is the part most people miss. They hear 1 billion fake DOT and assume $1 billion has gone missing. But that is not how markets work, especially not during a live exploit. Fake tokens do not automatically equal real money. To turn that fake supply into actual extracted value, you need liquidity. You need someone on the other side of the trade. You need deep enough pools. You need time. You need functioning exit routes. And most importantly, you need to get out before everyone else realizes the asset you are selling is contaminated. That apparently did not happen here on anything close to the headline scale. The attacker only managed to walk away with around 108 Ether, roughly $237,000. Now, to be clear, that is still a serious exploit. That is still real money. That is still a major failure for the system involved. But it is nowhere near what the raw headline suggested. And that matters, because it exposes one of the biggest illusions in crypto markets. On paper, value can look enormous. Market caps can look enormous. Fully diluted valuations can look enormous. Token dashboards can tell a very flattering story. But the real test of value is not what a dashboard says in calm conditions. The real test is what can actually be sold right now, in size, under pressure, while everyone is panicking. That is the truth serum. That is where theoretical value gets stripped away and the market tells you what is actually liquid and what is mostly fantasy. So, in a strange way, this exploit became a live demonstration of the difference between nominal value and realizable value. On paper, the attacker controlled a mountain. In practice, they could only carry a backpack out of the building. And that is not just a funny detail. It actually tells you a lot about crypto's structure. Because shallow liquidity became an accidental line of defense here. Not a good line of defense, obviously. You do not want your security model to be that the thief cannot find enough buyers. But it does show that exploits are often two separate problems. First, can the system be compromised? Second, can the attacker convert that compromise into large-scale extracted value? In this case, step 1 was alarming. Step 2 was much less successful. Now, the other reason this story matters is psychological. Users do not experience these events as neat technical incidents. They experience panic. They see headlines about fake DOT. They see giant numbers. They see exchanges reacting. They see people on social media shouting that a chain is dead before they have even worked out what actually happened. That reaction matters, because market narratives spread faster than forensic analysis. Most traders do not wait for a technical post-mortem. They react to the headline, the rumor, and the first few exchange responses. And that brings us to another big part of this story. Major South Korean exchanges reportedly paused DOT deposits and withdrawals as a precaution. Now, from the exchange point of view, that makes total sense. If there is any risk of contaminated bridged assets, weird flows, or confusion over which tokens are safe, you lock things down until you know where you stand. That is basic operational caution. But from the point of view of a normal market participant, it reinforces the fear that something much deeper may be broken. Even if the native Polkadot chain itself is fine, the optics of an exchange freeze make the whole situation feel systemic. And that is one of the reasons bridge risk remains so underpriced in this industry. It is not just about technical risk, it is narrative risk, it is trust risk, it is market structure risk. A bridge exploit does not stay neatly contained in a developer discussion. It spreads outward. It becomes an exchange issue. It becomes a liquidity issue. It becomes a sentiment issue. It becomes a price issue. It becomes a branding issue for the entire ecosystem tied to the ticker. Even when the exploit is technically isolated, the fear rarely is. This is why I do not think the lazy takeaway here is Polkadot is broken. That is too broad, too sloppy, and probably wrong. The better takeaway is that cross-chain infrastructure remains one of the weakest parts of crypto, and the market still struggles to separate bridge failure from chain failure in real time. Those are not the same thing. Native chain security, wrapped asset security, bridge governance, liquidity conditions, and exchange handling are separate layers. In a panic, they all get mashed into one story. But if you actually want to understand what happened, you have to pull them apart. And there is a broader industry lesson here as well. Crypto still loves abstractions. It loves telling users that everything will be smooth, connected, chain agnostic, and composable. Developers love that language. Investors love that language. Marketers definitely love that language. But every abstraction hides complexity somewhere. And in crypto, that hidden complexity often lives in the bridges, the wrappers, the oracles, the admin controls, the message relays, and the emergency mechanisms that people barely think about until something goes wrong. The smoother the user experience looks on the front end, the more careful you often need to be about what is happening underneath. What happened to the hacker afterwards is one of the most frustratingly familiar parts of this whole story, because just like so many other crypto exploits, the attacker does not appear to have been caught. After minting the fake bridge DOT, they moved quickly, swapping what they could into around 108 Ether, roughly $237,000, before the market fully closed in. And they did not just leave the funds sitting there in one obvious wallet either. The Ether was reportedly moved on again in smaller chunks, which is exactly the kind of thing you would expect from someone trying to muddy the trail and make life harder for anyone tracking them. So yet again, we are left with another crypto exploit where the weakness gets exposed, the panic spreads, the attacker gets paid, and the person behind it disappears into the background. And that is what makes the aftermath feel so unsatisfying, because there is no clean ending here, at least not yet. There is no story of the hacker being dragged into the light, no clear recovery of the funds, no neat bit of justice to wrap it all up. Instead, it is the same pattern crypto keeps seeing over and over again. A vulnerability gets hit, fake value gets turned into real money, the funds start moving, and by the time the market has understood what happened, the attacker is already halfway into the fog. So that is part of the real takeaway here. Not only do these bridge exploits keep happening, but once again, the hacker appears to have got away, and that keeps feeding the same uncomfortable question every time one of these stories breaks. How many times can this industry keep calling itself the future of finance while the people pulling off these attacks still keep slipping away? Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you are following the show, and as always, we will see you at the top.